another way of getting rid of that surplus fabric we don't want, the surplus fabric that enables the material or the fabric to sit round the body, fit over the bust into the waist, is to not use a dart, but maybe put it in a seam. So if I go back to this block that we made earlier, and again place it along the dots and the crosses so I know it's on grain, and I draw around, so there's the waist dart. We put the bust point in, and the dart apex. There's my bust point. So when you're working off your blocks, which are very often in cardboard because you keep drawing around them again and again for different designs, you're transferring it onto paper so you can manipulate it, and that's drafting your pattern. You may do that a few times before you get your shape that you really want, and once you have got your shape that you want for your pattern, it's then that you add your seam allowances on. So you will notice I'm always working without seam allowances, because seam allowances are something that we add on at the end, because they're just there in order to be able to sew our garment together. But while you're working out shapes and things, you don't need to add seam allowances. So I've just drawn around the block, which has one dart. What if I wanted a seam line, what we call panel lines in, rather than darts? So I'm just going to turn this around so it faces me. I could bring in a seam rather than put a dart here, because then I'd end up with a dart there and a dart there and this sort of point going on here. But what if I brought in a seam and I wanted to make this two pieces? So I could come through the bust point, come down that side of the dart, so there's one shape. Come back down this line again. This is purely a design line. Then we go into the dart, which is the shaping, and back down that side of the dart. Use a different colour. And then that becomes another pattern piece. So we've got one pattern piece there, and we've got a pattern piece there. I haven't added anything in extra or taken anything out more than what we already had, which is this dart. There's the dart. But rather than sewing a dart into a point, I'm just going to continue and make that a seam. So I get rid of this surplus fabric that we don't want, so I'm maintaining the shape around the bust, but I put it into panel lines. And so if I was to cut up here, you see how there's no seams anywhere? Because I'm still working on the shape that I want. And my eye is being drawn to my final design lines. So when you cut out, rest your scissors on the table and then let's mix it more steady. Okay, I've cut that little shape out, which going back to the block is this little shape, yeah? Yeah? That's one pattern piece. Now I'm going to cut this piece out. So I cut up the other side of the dart, because don't forget the dart is surplus fabric. We don't need it. Around the neck. No, not a seam in sight, okay? This is all without seams. And there are my two pattern pieces. Now if I was to cut this out in fabric and close that dart, it would create a shape. If I was to cut these two pieces in fabric and sew that seam, which is now a continual seam, or a panel line, it would make the same shape as that. The one last thing that I haven't done, and I should have done, perhaps before I cut that out, I should have marked some notches. Can't sew without notches. And it guides you round. Let's put another notch this side of that curve over the bust. When you're sewing curves, you want to make sure you've got some notches to keep you on track. And now I can make that into a panel line. So if I then show you this, and I don't know if you can see it on films, I've done it in pencil, but here's the net pattern pieces, no seam allowance, and then I've gone and added 0.5 cent seam allowance all the way around where I would sew, and so when I sew that together it'll come back to our basic shape. And if you like, at home, if you want to cut it out in some fabric, if you're going to play with manipulating your darts, and we'll give you some instructions and shapes as to what we want you to do. But then if you wanted to take it one step further, there's nothing to stop making a pattern. This is now a pattern because it's got seam allowances on it. And then you could cut it out, you could sew it together, and you could make a tiny little top in calico or some fabric that you've got at home, just to see the shape appear.